Hello, Internet, and welcome to this week's edition of 1 Minute Answers from 1 Minute Economics, the show where I answer your economics related questions in a minute or so each. And for this week, we have 5 questions lined up, all of them related to China. But before answering them, I want to pick the topic for next week, and the topic for next week is going to be plain and simple, the internet. So if you have a general question about anything economics related that has to do with the internet, for example, the economic impact of the internet, or maybe you have concerns about maybe certain sectors overheating like tech stocks, or concerns related to what we would do if for one reason or another we would no longer have internet access, economically speaking, of course. Whatever it may be, simply ask me by writing a comment below, and I will do my best to answer your questions next week. For today's first question, Sorin would like to know how angry China is at the United States. And on the one hand, of course, especially if you follow mainstream media outlets, there's a lot of rhetoric that includes the word hate or similar ones when it comes to things like the situation in the South China Sea, for example. But realistically speaking, my assessment of China when it comes to its diplomatic relationships with other countries in general and the United States in particular is the fact that I don't really think we can use the word hate to describe these relationships, because I, for one, tend to consider China a very level-headed and pragmatic player on the international scene. And this is what makes China dangerous, in fact, because a hot-headed opponent is a weak opponent, and China is most definitely not in that situation. So I, for one, tend to see China as the type of international player that diligently seeks to maximize returns, to pursue its goals, but it does so in a fairly non-confrontational and, again, not hot-headed manner. So despite the fact that there are going to be tensions, there are going to be all sorts of issues that, can be considered tricky, I don't see China as the type of flamboyant international player for which you can say that the word hate is appropriate. They want to defeat the United States, they want to become the world's #1 economic superpower, but at the same time, what makes them dangerous is precisely the fact that it seems to me that they're willing to wait it out, they're willing to adjust their strategy whenever necessary, and so on. So when it comes to moving from a communist system to a more market-oriented one or anything else of that nature, China has proven that it can be the type of country that's able to show flexibility, that's able to adapt and pursue its goals in, at the end of the day, an effective manner. So the word hate, you can use it when it comes to all sorts of other countries, but when it comes to the diplomatic strategy of China, believe it or not, I think the word in question is not appropriate. For today's second question, Cooper S. would like to know what kind of an effect the decision of the Chinese authorities to curb the gift-giving culture in China in an effort to fight corruption is likely to have on the luxury sector, locally as well as internationally. Now, let me just say, as someone who lives in Romania, which is a country that has its own problems with corruption, gift giving and all sorts of other things that have to do with corruption are frequently deeply entrenched in a country's culture. And in China, just like pretty much everywhere else, there's this tradition of giving gifts, of doing all sorts of things, which eventually led to a culture of corruption. And the Chinese authorities, rightfully so, have recognized that this is a huge issue that can drag the country down, or if not drag it down, then keep it from reaching its true potential. So they've decided to crank down on it. And as of 2012, they have indeed said, okay, it's time to limit gift giving, it's time to address this issue head on. And they have, and the results have been dramatic for local players and all sorts of let's say, luxury sectors. And yes, there have been, for sure, international reverberations as well. Because the tricky thing with China is this. The country has grown so much, and this has been a blessing for all sorts of businesses, because all of a sudden, you had a brand spanking new and at the same time huge middle class, you had a new economic elite as well, and you had basically a bunch of people who are now more prosperous than in the past and want to spend money. So a lot of companies have made a lot of money thanks to China. But as it frequently happens in economics, if you live by China, you can die by China. And a lot of capital misallocation decisions have been made by companies locally and internationally as well, based on the flawed assumption that things are always going to be rosy in China. However, that's obviously not going to happen. And yeah, a lot of companies have overextended themselves, they've invested too much, they've grown too much, and they've done all sorts of things in an unsustainable manner. And when something like the 2012 situation happens in China, all of a sudden, your business is devastated. Again, if you live by China, you die by China. And this is something that's not just limited to our discussion right now about the luxury sector. The same thing has happened in the kind of sort of distant past when they cranked down on cryptocurrencies. A lot of business models have been affected. The same principle has been valid when it comes to all sorts of other industries. And I think it's ridiculously important for companies to know that being too dependent on China is never a good idea. The third question for today has been asked by Krishna, who would like me to refer to reforms in China, generally speaking. And since this is a loaded question, and of course I only have a minute, I'm going to refer to the main direction that I envision for China when it comes to reform. And as mentioned in my answer to Sorin's question, there are a lot of praiseworthy things to say about China reform-wise, and it is spectacular how they've managed to transition to a more market-friendly economy. That being stated, though, as someone who observes the performance of China economically speaking, as well as someone who occasionally interacts with economically active people from China, let me just say that it's downright scary how much capital misallocation one can witness in China right now. And I'm referring to things from the popular ghost cities that you guys have probably heard about, to the tendency of Chinese investors, both state and private, to allocate capital in a pump and dump manner, to all sorts of other issues. I'm frequently shocked when I see how unsustainable a lot of things are in China, and for this reason, I personally would not be the least bit surprised if the next bubble that's going to pop will be China. So, yeah. They've done some impressive stuff, but in my opinion, just like it was necessary to transition to a more market-friendly system, it's now going to be necessary to transition to a more sustainable model in which, one, you of course keep exporting and keep your status as a huge exporter, but two, you do your best to nurture smart and sustainable internal consumption, because otherwise, I just don't envision a path of sustainable growth for China. So I do believe that a lot of reform is necessary in the area of sustainability, because as it is, of course, China has grown a lot, it's a success story, blah blah blah, but at the same time, if something isn't done, then a lot of what's going to be created in China, and a lot of what has been created in China, is nothing more than fake wealth, and all it takes is one powerful exogenous shock, and all of this paper wealth can evaporate just like that. Question number 4 is quite interesting for sure, and Remy would like to know which country, China or India, is more likely to dominate Asia in the following years. Now, of course, the answer to this question will inevitably lead us in the realm of speculation, but I do believe that within limits, a bit of speculation here and there is healthy. So I'm going to give it my best shot. Right from the beginning, I'm going to say that as I'm seeing the data right now, China is, of course, a lot better positioned than India. So, for example, when it comes to their GDP, China has a GDP right now of approximately 11.2 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, whereas India is at 2.2 trillion. So, yeah, China, as we speak, has a GDP that's roughly 5 times greater than that of India. Even more so, the growth rate for China has been better as well, with, for example, over the past 10 years, the economy in China growing by over 3 times, whereas when it comes to India, they've had an impressive growth rate as well, just not as good, with their GDP growing by more than 2 times. So yeah, based on the data we have right now, China is clearly the better positioned nation. But a lot of things can go wrong, and just like China has had a dramatically impressive run over the past years, of course, the exact opposite can happen. So there are all sorts of scenarios in which things could be balanced out. For example, there could be a huge crash in China. That's one situation. 2, India might end up having an amazing economic growth rate for an extended period of time, and in doing so, obviously, they'd recover a lot of lost ground, if you will. So in the world of economics, nothing is certain. A lot of things can happen, but for me personally, it's hard to believe that in the near to mid future, we can see India surpassing China in economic terms. Both countries are economic, military, whatever, superpowers. Both countries are, case studies that people are going to refer to in a positive way when it comes to the future, in my opinion. I see good things for both of these nations, but in the end, my best guess is that we can consider China the favorite, if you will. For today's final question, Rohan would like me to talk about the top policies of China and, of course, the agenda behind them. And since we only have a minute, again, I'm only going to refer to the most important ones, in my opinion, of course, and I'm going to pick the top 3 that have my attention. Number 1 is something I referred to previously, the idea of moving from an exclusively export-driven growth model to something that encompasses more internal consumption. So as to not confuse you guys and give you a point of reference, their intention is moving a bit away from the German growth model and more towards a growth model that's similar to what the United States has, with, of course, their intention being of ultimately landing somewhere in the middle. So yeah, that's going to be a challenge for sure, but if they want sustainable growth, they do have to tackle the issue of smart and sustainable internal consumption as well. Number 2, we have their intention of asserting themselves as, at the very least, regional leaders, but most likely international leaders as well. And, there are 2 dimensions. For example, as we all know, there are long-standing diplomatic issues that China has. For example, the situation with Hong Kong and what's happening in Taiwan. So that's an issue. Then you have stuff like the South China Sea dimension and their intention of showing strength politically and militarily as well. Kind of like them saying, yeah, we've had impressive economic growth, but look at us now. We now want to take things to the next level politically as well, militarily as well, and so on. So I definitely think we're going to see more and more of China trying to assert itself as a leader. Number 3, tackling the political issues that have arisen. For example, the fact that Donald Trump has been elected as president of the United States, and he tends to have, let's say, a pretty complex relationship with China, at least when it comes to statements, with him frequently criticizing the way China does things, with him frequently blaming China for a lot of stuff. So yeah, managing the relationship with Donald Trump is going to be a major issue in China for sure, and this may very well tie in with number 2, their idea of asserting themselves as leaders. And now that the United States has decided to take steps back when it comes to leadership on the international front with, an America First policy, China in some cases already has decided, and they might decide to do even more of this in the future, to see this as an opportunity, as a void that needs to be filled, and we may very well keep seeing this pattern with the United States taking steps back internationally and China taking advantage of it. That's it for today, guys. Thanks a lot for tuning in to yet another edition of 1 Minute Answers from 1 Minute Economics. And remember, the topic for next week is the internet. So feel free to ask me anything at all related to the economics of the internet, the concerns you might have, such as overheating tech stocks, what would happen to society if we lost internet access, and so on and so forth. Whatever it may be, ask me by writing a question below, and I will do my best to answer next week. As usual, please like my videos, comment, engage in debates, be active in the community, and if you haven't by now, subscribe to 1 Minute Economics. Also, if possible, please develop the habit of telling your friends and contacts about the 1 Minute Economics YouTube channel, because even something like a quick share on Facebook, a tweet, a like on LinkedIn, and so on helps a lot. And finally, those who can afford to and want to support the channel financially as well can do so by buying my Wealth Management 2.0 book, by donating through PayPal, Patreon, Bitcoin, and so on. For more info, head on over to 1minuteeconomics.com. Thanks a lot, guys, and have an awesome weekend.